December 23, 1944, dawned over Bastogne with a sky streaked by the roar of engines and the flash of anti-aircraft fire. German soldiers, encircling the small Belgian town, braced for what they believed would finally force the 101st Airborne Division to surrender. But what they saw instead was something unprecedented. 241 American C-47 transport planes slicing through heavy flak, dropping over 1,000 tons of supplies, including ammunition, food, and life-saving blood transfusions. Witnesses from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division would later describe a moment of collective shock and disbelief. In that instant, they realized that they were not fighting an ordinary army. They were confronting an industrial civilization capable of sustaining its troops against overwhelming odds, a realization that would haunt Wehrmacht veterans for the rest of the war. By December 1944, the Ardennes forest had become the scene of Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces sought to cut through Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and destabilize Western Europe before winter could stall their advance. Bastogne, a small Belgian town with 7 key road junctions, became a strategic linchpin. The 101st Airborne Division, newly deployed and lightly equipped for winter warfare, found itself surrounded. German soldiers, particularly from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, observed with grim satisfaction as supply lines to the Americans were cut and food, ammunition, and medical resources dwindled. Commanders anticipated a swift capitulation. Yet the situation on the American side was anything but desperate. General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, refused to consider surrender. His now famous reply, "Nuts," became emblematic of American resolve. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army Air Forces were preparing a bold, high-risk operation to sustain the besieged defenders through airborne resupply. German war diaries from this period note the intense vigilance of their troops, scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. Soldiers reported expecting sporadic reconnaissance flights or small-scale supply drops. But what they were about to witness was unprecedented in scale and ambition. 241 C-47s, laden with over 1,000 tons of critical supplies, approached Bastogne in tight formations despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, snow, and sub-zero temperatures. From the perspective of the German besiegers, the sight was initially confusing. Colored parachutes dotting the winter sky, each carrying desperately needed supplies, seemed almost surreal. Ammunition, rations, medical kits, and blood plasma descended in a seemingly endless cascade. To experienced German soldiers, who were familiar with sieges and the limitations of wartime logistics, this level of operational capacity was beyond comprehension. By the end of the day, Wehrmacht commanders would later recount in interrogations that the sight of planes continually delivering supplies to the surrounded Americans was a turning point in morale. The realization dawned. No matter how tight the encirclement, the 101st would never be starved into surrender. Bastogne had become not just a tactical stronghold, but a symbol of industrial power, organizational skill, and American ingenuity. As German forces tightened their grip around Bastogne, American commanders faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled and under constant artillery bombardment, required continuous supplies of ammunition, food, and medical essentials to hold their positions. Overland supply routes were impossible. The snow-laden Ardennes roads were clogged with German troops, tanks, and obstacles. Without intervention, the division would have faced imminent collapse. The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, devised a bold solution, a massive aerial resupply mission. Hundreds of planners coordinated the deployment of C-47 Skytrans, determining payloads, drop zones, and timing, all under the threat of enemy flak and winter storms. Each C-47 carried 4 to 5 tons of supplies, and flight crews were tasked with delivering hundreds of tons in a single day. An audacious logistical feat given the risks. In the weeks leading up to December 23rd, air crews trained rigorously, practicing precision drops under simulated conditions, factoring in snow, wind, and enemy fire. Supplies were carefully packed in containers with brightly colored parachutes to mark American drop zones. Everything, from ammunition crates to blood plasma for wounded soldiers, had to be calculated to maximize survival and maintain combat readiness. Meanwhile, German troops were unaware of the scale of the American plan. Encircled soldiers relied on their experience and military logic. If roads were blocked and towns surrounded, the defenders would eventually starve or run out of ammunition. Commanders like General Major Heinz Kokott monitored the skies, expecting only sporadic reconnaissance or small-scale drops. Nothing in their experience suggested that the Americans could maintain a continuous, massive resupply by air. On December 23rd, at dawn, the first waves of C-47s approached Bastogne. German soldiers stationed in forward positions reported a sudden surge of aircraft, nearly 250 in number, glinting in the winter sunlight. Anti-aircraft units opened fire, yet pilots maintained formation and precise flight paths. For the German besiegers, who had relied on the principle of siege attrition, this sight was both bewildering and demoralizing. Colored parachutes, hundreds in the sky at once, descended slowly across the landscape. Ammunition, rations, winter clothing, and life-saving blood plasma were visible even from German lines. Diaries from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division describe a collective shock at the logistical scale and precision of the operation. Soldiers wrote of disbelief, realizing that no matter how long they held Bastogne, the Americans could replenish their forces by air faster than Germany could advance by road. The psychological impact was immediate. Veteran German troops, accustomed to measuring military effectiveness by attrition and supply control, were forced to rethink their assumptions about American capacity. Where once they had believed that encirclement equaled inevitability, now they faced the startling reality that the 101st Airborne could fight indefinitely, supplied continuously from the air. Meanwhile, U.S. crews executed the operation with remarkable skill. Pilots flew low enough to drop supplies accurately, despite flak and poor visibility. Ground crews at Bastogne collected crates with urgency, distributing ammunition to defensive positions, food to sustain morale, and medical supplies to treat the wounded. The seamless coordination between air and ground units demonstrated a level of organizational sophistication that far exceeded German expectations. For German commanders observing the operation, it became clear that the war was not being fought solely on tactics and terrain, but on industrial capacity and logistical innovation. The United States, with its vast manufacturing base and organizational prowess, could outproduce and outsupply the Wehrmacht, even under conditions that Germany considered favorable. By the end of December 23rd, German units around Bastogne were in a state of moral and psychological collapse. Interrogations conducted after the war reveal that soldiers felt powerless, witnessing the Americans' ability to sustain combat effectiveness against all odds. Bastogne was no longer merely a contested town. It was a symbol of industrial resilience and national determination, demonstrating that the 101st Airborne would never surrender because America's logistical reach was unmatched. 4 German soldiers encircling Bastogne, December 23, 1944, became a day of stark revelation. Veteran troops of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, experienced in siege warfare and artillery tactics, had long relied on traditional strategies, cutting off enemy supply lines, wearing down defenders, and forcing capitulation. But the skies above Bastogne told a different story. From the moment the first C-47 Skytrans appeared, German soldiers were confounded by the sheer number of planes. Flak crews, trained to target reconnaissance or small-scale transport, were confronted with formations so dense that even seasoned observers struggled to comprehend the scale. Colored parachutes, dozens in view at once, marked the descent of essential supplies: ammunition, rations, medical kits, and blood plasma. Soldiers wrote in diaries that the visual impact was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. We were certain the Americans would falter under encirclement, yet hundreds of parachutes fell from the sky. It was as if the town was being fed by the heavens themselves. The men were silent, stunned. Flak crews attempted to engage the transports, firing hundreds of rounds. Yet pilots maintained tight formations, dropped cargo with precision, and often evaded direct hits. German gunners admitted in post-war interrogations that the plane's coordination, discipline, and resilience was terrifying. Each successful drop undermined their morale and redefined the enemy in their eyes. The psychological impact extended beyond awe. Soldiers realized that they were no longer fighting just a division. They were confronting the industrial might of the United States, a nation capable of sustaining troops in ways Germany could not match. Where German planners relied on attrition and disruption, American ingenuity and production capacity rendered these strategies ineffective. One veteran wrote, "We knew our artillery could harass them, but they were fed, armed, and healed faster than we could prevent it." It became clear the 101st would never surrender because their nation would not let them fail. The continuous drops also demonstrated the efficiency of American supply chains. Each crate, carefully labeled and delivered precisely where needed, illustrated the connection between industrial production and battlefield effectiveness. German troops, accustomed to scarcity and supply difficulties, were forced to admit the superiority of enemy logistics. Witnessing medical supplies and blood plasma descending from the sky also shocked German soldiers. They had seen wounded Americans treated rapidly and returned to combat, highlighting the contrast with German medical and supply shortages, where injured soldiers often waited days for care. The sight of entire blood supplies being parachuted into Bastogne shattered their assumptions about battlefield limitations. As the day progressed, morale among German units declined sharply. Commanders reported frustration, confusion, and disbelief in war diaries. Troops began to question the feasibility of the siege. How could they ever force surrender when the enemy was replenished faster than they could attack? This realization was pivotal. Bastogne was no longer just a strategic crossroads. It had become a symbol of American industrial and logistical superiority, a tactical and psychological turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. German soldiers, many of whom had been hardened by years of combat on the Eastern and Western fronts, recognized a fundamental truth. Germany could not match the production, organization, or resolve of the United States. By nightfall, the cumulative effect of the aerial resupply was clear. Morale plummeted, skepticism about the war effort intensified, and a sense of inevitability regarding Germany's defeat took hold. Diaries and post-war interrogations reveal that even the most experienced officers were shaken, realizing that technological skill, industrial capacity, and organizational innovation had rendered traditional siege tactics obsolete. By the evening of December 23, 1944, the German high command around Bastogne faced an unprecedented challenge. Officers from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and other besieging units gathered to assess the situation, confronted by the irrefutable evidence of American logistical prowess. Reports from forward positions described hundreds of parachutes carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies, each precisely delivered despite snow, flak, and the chaos of battle. General Major Heinz Kokott and his staff were forced to reconsider their assumptions. Traditional siege doctrine relied on cutting off supply lines, applying constant pressure, and forcing surrender through attrition. Bastogne, however, was immune to these classical strategies. Each American resupply run reversed shortages that German planners had counted on. Ammunition never ran out. Wounded soldiers returned to the line. Morale remained unbroken. War diaries and post-war interrogations provide insight into the German tactical reassessment. Siege attrition was futile. With supplies delivered by air, starvation or ammunition depletion was impossible under current conditions. Concentration of forces became risky. Attempts to break American positions were hindered by the knowledge that the defenders were continuously reinforced. Psychological impact on troops. Even experienced Wehrmacht soldiers, accustomed to harsh conditions and calculated sieges, reported despair and disbelief. Kokott noted in his memoirs that witnessing the supply drops felt like confronting an entirely new kind of warfare, one in which industrial capacity and logistical innovation dictated the battlefield, not merely numbers of troops or artillery placement. He wrote, "It was as though the Americans were operating on a plane beyond our reach. No siege could overcome this. No plan could account for the constant stream of supplies descending from the sky." The German tactical dilemma deepened when field units reported the diversity of supplies being dropped. Colored parachutes delivered everything from rifles and grenades to winter clothing and blood plasma, demonstrating a comprehensive and anticipatory supply chain. Unlike previous engagements, where German forces could predict enemy weaknesses, the Americans appeared preemptively prepared for every contingency. The scale of the operation forced German officers to recognize a fundamental reality. They were fighting an industrial civilization, not merely an army. This realization was as psychologically destabilizing as any battlefield defeat. In a war where ideology, discipline, and experience were long considered decisive, German soldiers were confronted with the supremacy of production, organization, and resource allocation. Field reports also indicate that the resupply operation altered German offensive behavior. Units hesitated to launch full-scale attacks, fearing high casualties against a well-supplied and resilient enemy. Patrols noted that every assault was met with fresh ammunition, reinforced positions, and renewed morale, undermining confidence in traditional tactical maneuvers. Even lower-ranking soldiers internalized the message. A corporal in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote, "We had surrounded them, yet they remained unbroken. Every time we fired, every push we made, they were replenished. It was not skill alone. They had something we could not match. We were fighting a force sustained by a nation itself, not just by its soldiers." By nightfall, the psychological and tactical implications were undeniable. Bastogne was unconquerable through conventional siege warfare. The German army's reliance on attrition, blockades, and numerical superiority was rendered ineffective. Officers reported diminished morale, increased anxiety, and doubt about broader operational objectives. The American aerial resupply also had broader strategic consequences. Intelligence officers analyzing the situation realized that future engagements could no longer assume supply shortages would weaken entrenched U.S. forces. The concept of a fast, decisive encirclement was no longer viable when the enemy could turn the skies into a supply highway. Bastogne became a proof of concept for industrially backed combat resilience, demonstrating that American industrial and logistical might could sustain troops indefinitely in otherwise hopeless situations. This tactical shock reverberated beyond Bastogne. German officers, previously confident in the principles of blitzkrieg and siege warfare, were forced to recalculate operational feasibility across the Western Front. The resupply of Bastogne illustrated that the United States' capacity to project industrial power directly onto the battlefield fundamentally altered the dynamics of warfare. For the besieged American forces, the resupply operation was a triumph not just of logistics, but of psychological warfare. German forces, watching parachutes descend and soldiers receive unlimited rations and medical care, recognized the futility of their siege. Morale among the 101st soared, while Wehrmacht troops grappled with a dawning sense of inevitability. They could not compel surrender when faced with an enemy whose strength extended far beyond the front lines. While the High Command assessed the tactical implications of the aerial resupply, individual German units and soldiers experienced the operation firsthand, witnessing its impact on the battlefield and morale. Diaries, letters, and post-war interrogations provide a vivid portrait of the psychological dissonance experienced by troops who believed Bastogne would fall swiftly. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Soldiers from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, tasked with encircling the town, reported seeing hundreds of parachutes descend like snowflakes across the Ardennes. They noted that every drop seemed meticulously coordinated, arriving precisely at points where American units could immediately utilize ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. One sergeant wrote, "We expected the Americans to be starving, to run out of bullets, to surrender. Instead, they were fed, armed, and ready for every attack we launched. Every time a plane passed overhead, our men whispered among themselves, 'How can this be?' Flak crews attempted to disrupt the operation, firing relentlessly at the low-flying C-47s. Despite this, pilots maintained tight formations, dropping cargo with astonishing precision. The repeated success of the air drops left German gunners frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly aware that their traditional methods of siege and attrition were ineffective. The 26th Volksgrenadiers' psychological strain. Repeated exposure to American aerial resupply created a cognitive crisis. Soldiers, trained to rely on calculated shortages, now confronted a situation where resources appeared limitless. Morale began to waver. Some veterans admitted feeling helpless and disoriented, as the siege tactics they had relied upon for years proved useless against a force sustained from the sky. In letters sent home, soldiers described their frustration and awe. Every time we thought we had them contained, more supplies arrived. It was as though the Americans could conjure food, bullets, and medicine from thin air. Our hearts sank. We were no longer just fighting soldiers. We were fighting a machine that never stopped feeding itself. Artillery and infantry observations. Infantry units near Bastogne also noted the resilience of the American defenders. Ammunition shortages never materialized. Wounded soldiers were treated quickly and returned to defensive positions. Food and medical care reached the front lines with remarkable efficiency. Artillerymen reported that every counterattack seemed matched by renewed American strength, creating the impression of inexhaustible resources. Diaries indicate repeated entries noting the unusual endurance and morale of the 101st, which German soldiers began to attribute not merely to fighting spirit, but to the industrial and logistical capacity of the United States. The role of blood plasma and medical supplies. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the aerial resupply was the inclusion of blood plasma and medical kits. German soldiers had expected that a prolonged siege would exhaust not only ammunition but medical resources. Instead, they observed the wounded being treated quickly and returned to combat, often with life-saving blood plasma delivered by parachute. A German lieutenant noted, "We had believed that isolating them would starve them, cripple them. Yet their wounded returned to the lines almost immediately." This was no ordinary army. It was an army backed by a nation that could sustain it against all odds. Recognition of the arsenal of democracy. By observing the resupply firsthand, German soldiers began to understand the broader reality of American industrial supremacy. Bastogne became more than a tactical stalemate. It was a demonstration of a nation's ability to project production capacity directly into a battlefield, sustaining troops in ways Germany could not replicate. Soldiers reported a growing sense of inevitability regarding the war's outcome. The 101st Airborne would never surrender because the industrial infrastructure of the United States could overcome any tactical encirclement or siege, rendering German strategies ineffective. Letters and post-war testimonies. Post-war interrogations confirmed the psychological impact on German units. General Major Heinz Kokott reflected, "Watching the supplies descend, I realized that no siege, no matter how meticulously planned, could break these Americans. Their nation supported them in ways we could never match." Bastogne was a turning point in my understanding of the war. Private soldiers echoed this sentiment, noting disbelief, frustration, and even admiration for the logistical ingenuity of their adversary. The resupply operation undermined confidence in German strategy while elevating respect for the American capacity for organized, sustained warfare. Summary of unit-level impact. From the level of individual soldiers to entire divisions, the Bastogne resupply operation had immediate and lasting effects. Frustration and moral shock. Soldiers realized traditional siege methods were futile. Recognition of industrial power. Continuous resupply highlighted American production superiority. Psychological weakening. Observing well-supplied, resilient defenders lowered German morale. Tactical paralysis. Commanders hesitated to attack, unsure of how to counter a force continuously reinforced from the air. By the end of December 23rd, German forces encircling Bastogne had come to a stunning conclusion. The 101st Airborne would not surrender, and their defeat was no longer a question of tactical skill, but of confronting the overwhelming industrial and logistical might of the United States. Bastogne, once a minor road junction, had become a symbol of inevitability and industrial supremacy that would resonate throughout the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. Following the monumental resupply on December 23, 1944, the siege of Bastogne entered a phase that further exposed the limits of German operational strategy. German commanders and soldiers, already shaken by the unprecedented scale of the initial aerial drops, faced continued challenges as the United States Air Forces maintained a persistent and methodical supply chain to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Continuous aerial deliveries. December 24th and 25th saw additional waves of 47 transports penetrating heavy flak and adverse weather to deliver food, ammunition, winter clothing, and medical supplies. German troops observed this relentless pattern, noting how every defensive position within Bastogne remained fully equipped, defying the traditional expectation that encirclement would exhaust resources. Soldiers in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in diaries. Day after day, supplies arrived without pause. We fired at the planes, yet they returned again and again. The Americans were never hungry, never out of ammunition, never broken. Even the harsh Ardennes winter, which slowed ground operations and reduced mobility, failed to disrupt American air supply efforts. For German soldiers accustomed to exploiting adverse weather to their advantage, this resilience was both shocking and demoralizing. Psychological impact on German troops. The continuous resupply reinforced a growing sense of hopelessness and inevitability among the besieging forces. Traditional siege tactics, attrition, artillery bombardment, and encirclement, were rendered ineffective. Morale declined sharply as soldiers recognized that their actions could not starve, weaken, or demoralize the 101st Airborne. Letters from the front describe a mix of awe, frustration, and resignation. We could not understand it. Every time we thought the Americans would falter, they received more supplies. Our attacks accomplished little. It became clear they would never surrender. Commanders also experienced intense psychological strain. Post-war interrogations revealed that officers struggled to adjust strategies in response to the unrelenting supply chain. Many began questioning whether the Ardennes offensive could succeed if isolated troops could be continuously reinforced by air. Operational challenges for German forces. The sustained aerial resupply imposed additional logistical and tactical burdens on German units. Attacks had to be carefully planned to avoid enemy counterfire, but any prolonged engagement risked losses without strategic gain, as defenders replenished losses almost immediately. Artillery units found their efforts blunted by the rapid replacement of munitions and personnel within Bastogne. Moreover, German intelligence reports noted that resupply was highly coordinated, with supply drops delivered precisely to critical positions. This level of operational efficiency contrasted starkly with German logistical difficulties, where shortages, miscommunication, and transportation bottlenecks hindered frontline effectiveness. American morale and tactical resilience. For the 101st Airborne, each successful drop reinforced morale and combat effectiveness. Troops who had endured encirclement, harsh winter conditions, and repeated attacks found renewed confidence in their ability to hold Bastogne indefinitely. Supplies were distributed immediately upon landing, ensuring that defensive lines remained strong and that soldiers could continue operations with minimal interruption. The presence of medical supplies and blood plasma meant wounded soldiers could return to combat, a factor that German forces observed with disbelief. Infantrymen reported seeing previously injured troops return to firing positions fully capable, further exacerbating the sense among German soldiers that the siege was untenable. Shifting German strategic calculations. By December 25th, German commanders were forced to reassess their offensive goals. High-ranking officers, including General Major Kokot, began reporting that the encirclement tactic at Bastogne was fundamentally compromised. Attempts to break American defensive positions were no longer viable, as losses incurred in assaults were rapidly offset by resupplied defenders. War diaries document a growing recognition that the Ardennes offensive could fail, not due to battlefield skill or bravery, but because of the Americans' industrial and logistical supremacy. Bastogne had become a vivid demonstration that modern warfare extended beyond immediate combat. It was equally a contest of production, organization, and resource management. The psychological collapse of Wehrmacht troops. As the resupply continued, German troops reported experiencing collective psychological collapse. The certainty that the 101st would never surrender induced frustration, fear, and demoralization. Experienced soldiers, who had fought across Europe, admitted in post-war interrogations that the aerial operation challenged their understanding of warfare itself. One officer recalled, "We had surrounded them, yet every day they were ready, supplied, and unwavering. It was as if the war we knew no longer applied. We could not starve them, we could not break them. The Americans had changed the rules. Symbolism and the arsenal of democracy. The resupply operation at Bastogne came to symbolize more than tactical success. It was a demonstration of America's industrial and logistical might. German soldiers understood that the battlefield was no longer defined solely by immediate combat effectiveness, but by the capacity of a nation to sustain, reinforce, and equip its troops. Bastogne represented a psychological and strategic turning point, a clear indication that the United States could project power and support indefinitely, even under extreme conditions. By December 26th, the reality had crystallized. The siege of Bastogne could not succeed through traditional methods. German forces had observed, day after day, that the defenders were resupplied faster than they could be attacked, making surrender impossible. Bastogne had become a living testament to industrial warfare, highlighting the decisive role of production, organization, and ingenuity in modern combat. By the final days of December 1944, the siege of Bastogne had reached its decisive phase. German commanders, confronted with the unrelenting aerial resupply of the 101st Airborne Division, faced a stark reality. Their encirclement was failing, and traditional siege tactics were powerless against American industrial might. The psychological and operational effects of this realization were profound, shaping decisions at both tactical and strategic levels. German commanders confront the inevitable. After repeated unsuccessful assaults and continued observation of supply drops, German High Command convened multiple planning sessions. Reports from the front lines were unanimous. American defenders were fully equipped, well-fed, and medically sustained, despite being surrounded by thousands of enemy troops. The repeated success of the aerial operation left German commanders demoralized and increasingly aware of the futility of further attacks. General Major Heinz Kokott, in post-war interviews, reflected on the experience. "We had assumed that cutting off Bastogne would force a surrender, but every day, supplies arrived as if by magic. Our artillery fire, our encirclement, it was all rendered ineffective. The Americans would not yield because their nation would not allow them to." The psychological impact extended beyond commanders to every level of the German army. Infantrymen reported disorientation and frustration. Soldiers accustomed to relying on scarcity and siege pressure to weaken defenders were confronted with an enemy whose resilience was fueled by an industrial machine far larger than anything they had faced. Continued resupply and defensive resilience. The airdrops continued, maintaining the division's strength and morale. Ammunition stocks never dwindled, food rations sustained combat effectiveness, and wounded soldiers returned to the front lines thanks to parachuted medical supplies. Each successive resupply run further undermined German confidence in the siege, highlighting the operational superiority of American logistics over traditional military force. Diary entries from German soldiers underscore the cumulative psychological impact. "No matter what we did, they were ready. Each time we thought we had an advantage, more supplies arrived. It was as if the town itself was alive, fed by a force we could not fight." Even minor observations had major effects. Soldiers saw new winter clothing arrive, replenishing units that had suffered from cold and frostbite. Ammunition for artillery and small arms arrived in perfect synchronization with defensive needs. Every detail of American planning amplified the sense of futility among German troops. Strategic implications of Bastogne. The failure to capture Bastogne had broader implications for the Ardennes offensive. German planners had counted on rapid victories at key road junctions to disrupt Allied logistics and supply chains. Bastogne's resilience halted momentum and forced a recalibration of offensive objectives. Commanders recognized that even heavily encircled enemy units could be sustained by air, rendering traditional encirclement tactics obsolete against a nation with America's industrial capacity. The operational consequences were immediate. German forces were forced to halt or delay attacks, withdraw exhausted units, and reconsider allocations of manpower and artillery. The inability to neutralize Bastogne slowed the entire offensive, contributing directly to the eventual failure of the Ardennes campaign. Psychological collapse of German troops. Perhaps the most enduring effect was psychological. Soldiers described growing hopelessness as they witnessed the unbroken spirit and continuous replenishment of the defenders. Even elite units, seasoned by years of combat on multiple fronts, admitted that morale was severely undermined. One veteran noted, "We had surrounded them, yet every day they were ready, supplied, and unyielding. No amount of pressure could force them to surrender. It became clear that the war we knew had changed. We were fighting not just soldiers, but an industrial giant capable of endless reinforcement." The retreat, an American triumph. By the end of December 26th, German commanders began to withdraw certain units to conserve forces for defensive operations elsewhere. The siege of Bastogne had failed not because of tactical brilliance on the American side, but because the logistical capacity of the United States rendered encirclement irrelevant. The 101st Airborne Division had remained combat effective, supplied, and resolute, a testament to the power of industrialized warfare. From the perspective of the besieging troops, the retreat was both a tactical necessity and a psychological blow. The arsenal of democracy had demonstrated its supremacy. German soldiers left the battlefield with an unmistakable awareness. They had faced a force sustained not by individual heroism alone, but by the full weight of a nation's production, coordination, and ingenuity. Legacy of the Bastogne resupply. The aerial operation at Bastogne became a case study in the integration of logistics, morale, and combat strategy. For the Allies, it reinforced the value of industrial production, coordination, and air power in modern warfare. For the Germans, it was a humbling demonstration that even elite troops could be neutralized not by direct combat, but by the unmatched ability of an opponent to sustain and resupply forces efficiently. Post-war analyses and memoirs highlight Bastogne as a turning point in psychological and operational understanding. The siege showed that battlefield victories required more than tactical skill. They depended on production capacity, supply chains, and the ability to maintain combat effectiveness under extreme conditions. Conclusion of Part 7. By the end of this phase, Bastogne had proven itself indestructible in the face of traditional military logic. German troops had witnessed the power of American industrial might firsthand. The 101st Airborne's resilience, sustained by 241 C-47s delivering over 1,000 tons of supplies, shattered expectations, altered German tactical calculations, and became a lasting symbol of logistical supremacy in warfare. Bastogne demonstrated that in modern conflicts, the ability to supply, sustain, and reinforce troops can be more decisive than sheer numbers or battlefield heroics. The German forces' retreat marked the end of the siege, but the lesson endured. Industrial capacity and logistical mastery were now central to victory in total war. The successful aerial resupply of Bastogne did more than secure a small Belgian town. It altered the strategic landscape of the Ardennes offensive and demonstrated the decisive power of industrial logistics in modern warfare. German commanders, forced to confront an enemy whose capacity to supply and sustain troops far exceeded their own, began to question the very feasibility of their offensive campaigns. Impact on German strategy. Bastogne's resilience had immediate strategic consequences. The Ardennes offensive relied on rapid penetration, disruption of Allied supply lines, and the capture of key towns to facilitate further advances toward Antwerp. German high command assumed that encircling Bastogne would neutralize the 101st Airborne and open the road for continued movement. Instead, the American resupply showed that even isolated units could maintain combat effectiveness indefinitely when backed by superior logistics. War diaries from German divisions report a stark realization. Our plans assumed attrition and supply disruption would force surrender. Bastogne proved that even surrounded troops could fight endlessly when their nation could feed and equip them from the skies. As a result, German units had to adjust offensive priorities, withdraw exhausted forces, and abandon the expectation of swift victories, delaying operations elsewhere on the Western Front. Bastogne had become a psychological and operational anchor, halting momentum and forcing the Wehrmacht to reconsider the practical limits of their campaigns. Psychological effect on German soldiers. Witnessing repeated airdrops shattered the belief that encirclement guarantees capitulation. Diaries and post-war interviews highlight a sense of powerlessness and disbelief among frontline soldiers. Even experienced veterans, hardened by years of combat, admitted that morale plummeted as they observed the 101st being continuously resupplied. A soldier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote, "We thought the Americans would collapse under pressure. Each day we saw crates fall, blood plasma for their wounded, and winter clothing. It became clear that our efforts were futile. They would never surrender." The psychological impact extended to officers as well. Commanders, accustomed to calculating attrition and expecting sieges to succeed, faced the reality of an industrially sustained enemy. Bastogne illustrated that victory no longer depended solely on battlefield skill, but on a nation's capacity to project resources into combat. American morale and psychological warfare. For the 101st Airborne, the resupply operation had dual effects. It sustained physical combat readiness and boosted morale, reinforcing the belief that their efforts were supported by a powerful, responsive homeland. Troops saw firsthand that no matter how dire the situation appeared on the ground, supplies would arrive in time. This knowledge enhanced confidence in defensive positions, strengthened cohesion, and increased the effectiveness of resistance against German attacks. The psychological contrast between the two sides was stark. While German soldiers experienced growing despair, the Americans maintained confidence and resilience, highlighting the broader strategic significance of industrial capacity in sustaining morale and combat readiness. Industrial power as a decisive factor. The resupply of Bastogne demonstrated the centrality of industrial production in total war. Germany, despite its experienced troops and tactical knowledge, could not match the United States in terms of logistics, organization, and rapid reinforcement. The operation highlighted a fundamental principle. In modern conflicts, industrial capacity can determine outcomes as decisively as battlefield maneuvers or combat bravery. Bastogne thus served as a case study in the psychological and strategic effects of logistical superiority. German forces realized that even their most elite troops could not overcome an opponent whose nation could produce, transport, and deliver essential supplies with precision and speed. The operation shifted German perceptions of the war from a contest of tactics and courage to a confrontation with the industrial and organizational might of the United States. Legacy of Bastogne in military doctrine. Military historians and analysts have cited Bastogne as a pivotal example of logistics shaping warfare. The aerial resupply operation underscored several enduring lessons. Supply lines are as crucial as troop strength. Cutting off supplies may no longer be sufficient when the enemy can project resources by air. Industrial capacity extends battlefield influence. A nation's ability to sustain troops can neutralize traditional siege tactics. Morale is tied to logistics. Well-supplied and reinforced units maintain psychological resilience, while besiegers suffer demoralization. Modern warfare integrates technology, production, and strategy. Tactical skill alone cannot guarantee victory without logistical and industrial support. Bastogne's lessons reverberated throughout the remainder of the European theater. German planners, recognizing the limitations of their approach, shifted defensive priorities and delayed offensive operations, contributing to the ultimate failure of the Ardennes offensive. For the Allies, the operation validated the strategic use of airborne logistics and highlighted the transformative impact of America's industrial power. With the German withdrawal from Bastogne, the siege had conclusively demonstrated the limitations of conventional military tactics against an industrially empowered opponent. While American forces celebrated a tactical and symbolic victory, German soldiers and commanders were forced to confront a sobering reality. Their assumptions about siege warfare, supply lines, and combat effectiveness were fundamentally outdated in the face of modern industrial power. German reflections on the siege. Post-war interrogations and memoirs from German officers reveal the psychological and strategic impact of the Bastogne resupply. Veteran commanders, including General Major Heinz Kokott, admitted that the aerial operation shattered confidence in traditional methods. "I had commanded sieges before, yet at Bastogne, every calculation failed. The Americans were resupplied endlessly. Our encirclement meant nothing." It was a revelation that modern war depended not solely on soldiers, but on the machinery of a nation. Lower-ranking soldiers echoed similar sentiments. Diaries from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division described feelings of helplessness and disbelief. "We had surrounded them. We fired our guns, yet they were never diminished. Every day, more food, More bullets, more medicine arrived. It was as if the town was sustained by the entire country, not just its soldiers. This recognition of industrial and logistical superiority profoundly affected German morale and reshaped perceptions of the war. Where once frontline troops believed that skill, courage, and tactical planning could achieve victory, they now confronted the overwhelming influence of production, supply chains, and national capacity. The psychological impact on German soldiers. The siege of Bastogne became a psychological turning point for many German soldiers. Witnessing the 101st Airborne Division maintain readiness and morale under encirclement undermined confidence and created a sense of inevitability regarding Germany's eventual defeat. Veterans recounted feelings of frustration and futility, acknowledging that industrial and logistical superiority could outweigh battlefield tactics. A corporal from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in a post-war letter, "We had fought across Europe, endured hunger, cold, and artillery fire, yet Bastogne was different. Their supply never failed. Their strength never waned. I realized that the war was no longer about us as soldiers. It was about the nations behind us." Strategic lessons learned. The siege underscored several enduring lessons for military strategists and historians. Airborne logistics can neutralize encirclement tactics. Bastogne proved that even surrounded units could sustain combat operations indefinitely when resupplied from the air. Industrial capacity determines strategic potential. A nation's ability to produce and transport essential supplies directly influences battlefield outcomes. Morale is intrinsically linked to logistical support. Well-supplied forces maintain resilience, while besieging forces experience declining confidence and psychological strain. Modern warfare integrates production, logistics, and combat skill. Tactical brilliance alone is insufficient. Success requires the coordination of resources, personnel, and technology. German commanders, reflecting on the operation, recognized that the Ardennes offensive had been compromised not by the skill of opposing soldiers, but by America's ability to sustain its troops. Bastogne demonstrated that industrial capacity could dictate battlefield outcomes, forcing a re-evaluation of German offensive strategies and priorities. The American perspective and legacy. For the United States, Bastogne exemplified the effective use of airborne logistics and industrial might. The 101st Airborne Division's ability to withstand encirclement was directly tied to production capacity, coordination, and meticulous planning. Military historians have since cited Bastogne as a case study in integrated warfare, where logistics, morale, and combat operations were inseparable. The operation also reinforced the broader concept of the arsenal of democracy, illustrating how national production capabilities could project power directly onto the battlefield. Bastogne became emblematic of a new era of warfare. Victory was no longer solely determined by battlefield maneuvers, but by the capacity of a nation to sustain, reinforce, and equip its forces continuously. Historical significance. Bastogne's aerial resupply had lasting implications beyond the Ardennes. It influenced post-war military doctrine, emphasizing the importance of rapid, coordinated logistics in modern combat. The strategic value of air transport and supply operations. The psychological effects of industrial-backed resilience on both defenders and attackers. The integration of production capacity into operational planning, making national industrial strength a decisive factor in warfare. For German soldiers and commanders, Bastogne became a symbol of operational and psychological defeat, demonstrating the limits of traditional tactics against a technologically and industrially superior opponent. For American forces, it validated the strategic approach of leveraging production and logistics to achieve decisive outcomes, solidifying the role of industrial capability in modern military doctrine. Conclusion of Part 9. The aftermath of Bastogne highlighted a profound shift in warfare. German troops, despite skill, experience, and determination, were unable to overcome an opponent sustained by superior production and logistics. The 101st Airborne Division's endurance, backed by 241 47 transports delivering over 1,000 tons of supplies, showcased that modern military success depended on the seamless integration of industrial capacity, logistics, and combat operations. Bastogne thus remains a defining example of the arsenal of democracy in action, demonstrating that in total war, national production and organizational skill can decisively influence outcomes on the battlefield, shape morale, and redefine strategic thinking. German forces departed the siege with a lasting understanding. The war was no longer simply fought with weapons and courage, but with the relentless capacity of a nation to sustain its forces in the field. While the strategic and psychological dimensions of Bastogne are well documented, the human element, how individual soldiers experienced the siege, offers a vivid portrait of its intensity and significance. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal the personal reactions of German soldiers facing an unstoppable resupply operation and American troops enduring the pressures of encirclement. German soldiers, shock, frustration, and awe. 4 German troops encircling Bastogne. The sheer scale of the American aerial resupply was both astonishing and demoralizing. Infantrymen and artillery crews, trained to rely on attrition to weaken the enemy, were confronted with a scenario they had never imagined. Well-supplied, resilient defenders who seemed impervious to their attacks. A private from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in his diary, "We fired shells, we attacked positions, yet they remained undiminished. Each day, supplies fell from the sky, and their wounded returned to fight. It was unlike any siege I had known. We could not comprehend it, and our morale suffered." Officers shared similar sentiments. A lieutenant noted in a post-war interview, "Our calculations assumed that starvation and lack of ammunition would force surrender. Instead, they were always ready. Their nation fed them, armed them, healed them. We realized we were not merely fighting soldiers, but the industrial strength of a country itself." Some soldiers admitted to a sense of awe at the precision and coordination of the resupply operations. Despite their training and combat experience, they recognized the remarkable organizational skill required to sustain the 101st Airborne under siege conditions. American soldiers, resilience and confidence. For American troops, the resupply operation reinforced morale, combat readiness, and a sense of national backing. Soldiers knew that, despite being encircled, their nation's industrial and logistical might ensured they would never run out of essential supplies. Private accounts describe the arrival of parachuted rations, ammunition, and medical supplies as a lifeline. Troops maintained defensive positions with renewed vigor, buoyed by the knowledge that every need would be met promptly. A soldier wrote, "We could hear the planes above, and with every crate that landed, our confidence grew. We knew we would not be abandoned, and the German attacks, no matter how fierce, could not break us." The presence of medical supplies, especially blood plasma, allowed wounded soldiers to return to combat quickly, maintaining unit cohesion and sustaining morale in extreme conditions. This capability was noted by German observers, who were often stunned by the speed and efficiency with which injured soldiers were treated and redeployed. Interactions between soldiers. While direct interaction between the opposing sides was limited, German soldiers often observed American behavior during supply drops. They reported seeing troops distribute rations efficiently, reinforce defensive positions, and prepare for counterattacks immediately after receiving supplies. This organized and disciplined response heightened the psychological impact on the besieging forces. Conversely, American soldiers frequently remarked on the presence and pressure of the German forces, noting that while the threat was constant, the knowledge that supplies would continue to arrive mitigated fear and maintained determination. The resupply operation became both a practical and symbolic element of their defensive strategy, demonstrating the power of logistics as a force multiplier. Psychological contrast. The personal perspectives reveal a striking contrast. German soldiers experienced shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of futility, recognizing that even encirclement could not overcome the Americans' logistical advantage. American soldiers experienced confidence, resilience, and reinforced morale, knowing that their needs would always be met through the industrial strength of the United States. This contrast highlights the psychological dimension of logistics. Sustained supplies not only maintain physical readiness, but also influence perceptions, morale, and decision-making on both sides of a conflict. Heroism and ingenuity. Individual acts of heroism also emerged during the siege. American soldiers braved anti-aircraft fire to retrieve parachuted supplies and distribute them under fire, while German troops attempted daring maneuvers to disrupt resupply operations. Both sides demonstrated courage and ingenuity, but the operational context, continuous American supply, amplified the effectiveness of American efforts while limiting the impact of German actions. A sergeant in the 101st Airborne described distributing ammunition to a forward position. The crates landed amidst snow and gunfire. We ran through the open ground, dodging shells, to ensure our comrades had what they needed. Every drop meant we could hold Bastogne another day. German soldiers, observing these actions, admitted in post-war accounts that the discipline and composure of the Americans under fire were both frustrating and admirable. They recognized that resilience was not merely individual, but systemic, rooted in organization and logistical support. Enduring lessons from personal accounts. The first-hand perspectives of soldiers provide invaluable insight into the human dimension of the siege. Morale is deeply tied to supply and support. Well-fed, well-armed troops maintain cohesion and determination. Psychological effects extend beyond the front lines. Observing a resupplied, resilient enemy undermines confidence and creates a sense of futility. Operational success depends on individual and systemic factors. Heroism and skill are magnified or limited by the broader logistical framework. Industrial and organizational capacity shapes battlefield perception. Soldiers internalize the power of production and logistics as directly affecting their survival and effectiveness.